We've been researching the use of diagramming techniques in systems thinking and practice at the Open University since the 1960s. This animation will show you how various diagramming techniques can be integrated into a comprehensive graphical systems modeling approach. The ideas for the rich picture and spray diagram were developed over several weeks as I read the case study. I tried to relate this to my own experience, directly as a user of air transport and indirectly through reports in the media about air travel and its impacts on climate change and the environment. I also discussed air travel with my colleagues, family and friends and began to explore the situation visually using a spray diagram and a rich picture. I started by putting the theme of my exploration at the center of my spray diagram. The spray diagram allowed me to classify the relatively messy situation into the sub-themes which concerned me. This helped me to organize the facts, issues, and ideas in an analytical way, and to break the main themes down into increasingly more detailed components. In a spray diagram, the emotional, creative, and political content that can be captured by a rich picture are excluded, and it's also difficult to represent the nature of relationships between components. So, drawing a rich picture allowed me to explore a wider range of components and issues, delving into areas that are difficult to represent analytically. I did start out with themes that I wanted to illustrate, like environmental impacts, the aviation white paper process itself, and the various stakeholders involved. But the images came to me spontaneously, and after a few rough sketches, I was satisfied that I had captured the main issues that I was concerned about. In fact, I was even able to identify myself as playing a role in the situation, and to think further about several processes. For example, how the consultation responses and direct lobbying influence the somewhat obscure and complex decision-making process within the Department for Transport. I could also highlight what seemed to me to be crucial consequences of aviation expansion by linking extra runways to increases in CO2 emissions, and then on to the devastating impact that climate change could have on some faraway tropical island. The rich picture is clearly my personal perspective and doesn't in any way represent an objective view of aviation expansion. But it is a way for me to learn about a situation and bring my own feelings and understanding to the surface. It's also a non-verbal means of exploring the politics of the situation. It allows me to use metaphorical modes of communication, such as the image of devastation caused by tsunamis, to emphasize my view of climate change, so it reveals my personal mental models. The strength of a rich picture is that it demonstrates both the understanding and the emotional stance of the person drawing it at a particular moment. This initial visual exploration of aviation expansion enabled me to progress with the case study. Drawing a systems map forced me to understand the situation in a more systemic way, by establishing a much clearer boundary between the system of interest that I was focusing on and its surrounding environment. This is in stark contrast to the spray diagram, where I carried out a relatively straightforward task of information ordering with no great purposeful intent. The task of identifying the various subsystems and components, which I saw as contributing to the particular situation, forced me to explore and make explicit my own understanding in systems terms. I had to make judgments on the choice of key components, how to group them, and where to draw a boundary. In the process of developing the systems map, I looked back at my spray diagram and rich picture and tried to identify the major components that I thought were relevant to this decision-making situation. Some of these components I thought made better sense if I broke them down into two or more separate parts. I also found myself needing some completely new components based on my reading. Next, I looked at all these components to identify any that seemed to fit together as subsystems of some larger or higher level system. I needed to make sure that the various systems, subsystems, or even sub-subsystems worked together to provide a description of the airport expansion environmental decision-making situation. I identified three key subsystems: the UK transport system, the airport and aviation stakeholder system, and the white paper production system. These three subsystems can be seen themselves to have distinct purposes: to move people and goods, to promote interests, and to produce strategic national policies. I felt that they captured my understanding and judgments on the salient features of the situation under investigation. Another course team member drew a completely different systems map of the same issue. So a systems map reveals just as much about the perspective of the author as about the situation under investigation. My final systems map turned out to be very useful for my own understanding, but a bit too complicated for communication purposes. I therefore redrew the diagram by removing many components. The systems map is a snapshot of the situation at a specific moment framed by the author's perspective. The boundaries effectively establish the scope of the system of interest, what is in the system of interest, and what is in its environment. Note that all the elements are entities, not processes, and the systems map doesn't attempt to portray the dynamic relationships between components, subsystems, and the overall system of interest. Concerns and ambiguities can't easily be represented in this form of diagram either. For the influence diagram, I selected various components and subsystems from within the systems map that seemed to affect each other. For example, the opposers of expansion provided information on the environmental impacts of aviation and airport expansion. I found the influence diagrams the most difficult to draw, especially because the term influence is difficult to grasp. When thinking about how to develop the influence diagram, I used a range of terms to help me along: power over, strength of relationship, and control. For example, which components had the strongest power to determine what other components did? In this case, I saw a clear link between the supporters of airport expansion and the process of producing the information on economic growth that was presented within the white paper. I felt that the opposers of expansion had much less power in determining the type and extent of the environmental impacts that were considered, especially the effects of aviation emissions on climate change. An influence diagram can in turn become a starting point for a multiple cause diagram, which is specifically aimed at exploring the cause and effect relationships between components in a system of interest. We are now moving completely away from ambiguous concepts, expressions of doubt, and relatively unspecified connections between components. The aim in a multiple cause diagram is to focus on the factors that may give rise to the dynamic behavior of a system of interest. Components are chosen that have clear cause and effect relationships, and whose change can be measured, at least in a qualitative way. For instance, increased tax on air travel will directly increase the cost of flights. Note that a common mistake is to try to include words such as increase or decrease in the name of a component. I've tried to name each variable in a neutral way. For example, simply demand for air travel and not increasing demand. This is because multiple cause diagrams can be used as the basis of quantitative mathematical models, and using words such as increase or decrease within a factor makes this more difficult. The system dynamics diagram of a simplified carbon cycle is one example of the structure of a mathematical model. In such models, variables may increase or decrease depending on the particular dynamics that are operating. The system dynamics diagram differentiates between things that accumulate or decrease over time, called levels, and activities or processes, called rates, that contribute to these changes in the amounts present. In this case, carbon quantities in the atmosphere, ocean and biosphere are levels, and the activities such as photosynthesis, deforestation and ocean uptake are rates. This diagram in effect identifies the components which can be quantified and whose cause and effect relationships can be expressed in a mathematical formula. What you have experienced in this diagramming animation is an overview of the qualities of different diagramming techniques, and how they can be used together in a complementary and thorough investigation. But you need to be aware that the linear sequencing of the animation can be misleading. Each diagramming technique reveals different conceptual and practical insights. Your learning will often be limited if you use a diagram as a one-off activity. The aim is to keep these diagrams alive throughout a systemic investigation and to monitor the insights that they can provide. Diagrams should evolve with your increasing understanding and engagement with others, and in turn the process of doing them should enhance your understanding. Each diagramming technique brings out particular aspects of your systemic practice, so using a wide range of techniques aids comprehensive understanding of a situation and brings your personal perspective to the surface. Done collaboratively, they have the potential to reveal multiple perspectives and different mental models, and they can be employed in negotiation and discussion. Diagramming is a crucial tool to engage with situations of complexity, both as a means to learn and increase your understanding about a situation.